Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Craig Jenkins-Sutton of Topiarius to talk about his experience with tree selection and planting. Craig's love of the landscape was a natural progression of his upbringing in central Minnesota, where he grew up at a youth camp. When he attended college in Chicago, he maintained his connection with the outdoors, which he soon realized his career path needed to encompass. In a confluence of events, Craig was hired as the operations manager at Chicago Christian Industrial League, managing the landscaping job training program. Most of the landscaping contracts were with the city of Chicago, where they maintained many of the city's green spaces, median strips, and public schools. Eventually, Craig joined Foley Landscape as construction manager in Massachusetts, where he continued to fine-tune his plant knowledge, installation skills, and design aesthetic. It was here that the vision of an urban landscaping business was formed, and in early spring of 2003, he returned to Chicago to start Topiarius. Craig's first landscaping job was completed out of the back of his Ford Focus wagon using 5-gallon buckets and a shovel. Originally, during the landscape season, they hired local college students to help out with labor. However, now they have gone from 2.5 employee operation to an 11-person operation with an office and landscaping yard on the west side of Chicago. Welcome to the show today, Craig.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Absolutely. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Well, quite honestly, it's a little bit of a convoluted path for a person who owns a landscape design, build, and maintenance firm in the city of Chicago. Seeing as how I don't really have any specific background or education in landscape or landscape design.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm fairly informally taught. However, the reality of the situation is that I got done with college and I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I kind of found my way into a landscaping jobs training program where I was working with formerly homeless clients of a drug and alcohol rehab center.
Wow.
And teaching them how to have a job. And then most of the sites that we maintained were City of Chicago sites. The city had contracted with the organization that we worked with to maintain certain properties, and kind of really got my feet wet in landscaping in that, and then spent a couple of years out in Massachusetts doing landscaping. And as I progressed through the early parts of my career, I realized a couple of things about myself. One, what I'm good at, which is dealing with people and working with my hands. The second thing is that I learned what I'm not good at, and that's having a boss.
Yeah, I resemble that remark.
Yeah. So it really was kind of the option when my wife and I moved back to Chicago from the East Coast. Was we really had intended on starting our own business. She got a job that had a steady income and health insurance, and I started Topiarius, and kind of from there we have just expanded the business, and we're now, I think there's 28 of us on a daily basis.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah.
Wow. So you mentioned it, Topiarius, that's your company. What do you do? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, we are a little bit like a landscape company and a little bit like an interior design company that does work on the outside, and a little bit like a construction company. So we're a little bit of a hybrid. We primarily work in the urban center of Chicago. So most of the customers have very small landscapes, so tiny little front yards that may be 5 feet deep and 25 feet wide.
Oh my gosh.
Some of them only have enough room for a container. They don't even have any plant material.
Yeah.
And then backyards range from, small little courtyards that, you walk out the door and you're in the garage in 3 steps, to 20-foot by 20-foot backyards where we have a little bit more space to do things.
Right.
And then actually probably the majority of our installation work at this point is done on roof decks, whether that's garage roof decks or roof decks on top of people's homes. And which is why we're a little bit like a construction company. We work in a totally built environment, and so we have to have crews that are capable of building things like high-end pergolas and containers and doing the decking and all of that. So, yeah, we run 3 carpentry crews, 3 installation crews, and we have 4 maintenance and fine gardening crews. And then kind of that other aspect of our business is the fine gardening, which most people would call maintenance. But because, again, these are such small urban spaces, when most people think maintenance, they think the mow and blow companies. They come, they mow, they blow the grass off.
Yep.
Well, we have 1 lawnmower, and it's a 21-inch push mower, and it gets used like 3 times a week. So our crews they're much more focused on horticultural maintenance, on integrated pest management.
Yeah.
We also do probably the nicest seasonal color rotations in the city of Chicago, if I may say so myself. And so we run, it's particularly during the seasonal rotation time, so early spring, summer, fall, and right after, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, when we're doing our winter rotations.
Oh, right.
We run anywhere from 2 to 3 crews full time, just doing installations in containers.
Really? What kind? Like food?
No, decorative. So like that beautiful front container at your front door, or in the backyard, you've got your little patio, and you've got the containers and window boxes. Kind of stuff.
Somebody could put herbs or vegetables in them.
And we actually highly encourage our customers, when they have roof decks that get sun, because most of our landscapes are fairly heavily shaded. But if you have a roof deck, we really encourage people to at least try and grow some vegetables, some herbs and some vegetables. Just I think that it's such a great way to at least have some connection with where our food comes from.
Yeah, exactly.
That when you understand how hard it is to grow something.
Yeah.
And then it's also great. A lot of our customers are parents and have kids, and it's a great activity that the kids can do. So.
Absolutely, man. I'll tell you, I've seen this over and over and over again. If a young person grows something from a seed, man, they're going to eat it no matter what it is.
Well, and that's absolutely true. My wife and I have a much larger yard for living in Chicago, which is why we actually purchased the house. But I have about 700 square feet of vegetable bed, which is unheard of in the urban setting. And we have friends that their daughter comes over, and she is just so excited when she can pull carrots out of the ground or beets, and then she goes home and she actually eats them, which normally she wouldn't do. So,
yeah. How cool is that? All right, you know what? You mentioned a couple of things along the way. Rooftop gardens. Tell us about one of your coolest rooftop gardens that you've installed.
Well, we always talk to customers about return on investment, and that return may be monetary and it may be personal enjoyment. And when you get the customer who isn't as concerned about the monetary return on investment as much as the enjoyment return on investment, you can get some pretty spectacular roof decks.
Oh,
so
I bet.
We had one customer on a couple of years ago. We started working with them, and they had a small deck off the back of their house, stairs going up to a garage roof deck, and then they have 2 other roof decks on the top of their home.
Wow.
And when we started, we were just concentrating on the back deck and the garage roof deck, and we tore off the existing deck and pergola that were on there and realized, the roof is going to need to be replaced as well. So we got a roofer in there, and as they were pulling the old roof membrane off, all of the plywood decking was coming
rotted.
up with it.
Yeah.
And then not only that, but all of the joists were completely rotted as well. And so we ended up having to replace the entire roof system on that garage roof. But then from there, you can do whatever because you know exactly what's going on.
Underneath.
So we had a huge pergola that has retractable shades, which we really encourage people in small spaces where you have one spot where you can sit outside and enjoy it. That's smaller. We encourage them to do a retractable shade because on a cooler day you may want the sun, and on hot days you want the shade. So it gives a little bit more function. And then they had heaters up there so that they could extend the season. We had heat-paste screen walls to give some privacy from alley neighbors.
Oh, nice, right?
And they had a piece of artwork that we just incorporated into the space. The decking was all done on a porcelain paver pedestal system, so there's no wood framing or anything. It's all these plastic adjustable pedestals.
Oh, interesting.
Which it's great because if you ever have an issue with the roof, you can just move those tiles away, patch the roof, put them all back, unlike a typical deck, which you would basically have to destroy the deck to do that. And then just kind of a fairly limited palette of plant material. They have a couple of containers for annuals, and then really the rest of the plantings is boxwood on that deck just because there's like 30 plants that work well on roof decks, and they wanted clean, simple, and easy, and boxwood made the most sense. Well, but then you've got all of these crazy things where you're trying to provide an enormous amount of different functions. So you've got outdoor kitchen, you've got dining, you've got seating, you've got the wine bar. Like you have to, on these small spaces, you've got to incorporate so many different things into these little spaces. So.
Wow. Cool. We need somebody like you here in Phoenix. You should come and visit and we should talk, right? Another thing you mentioned that I wanted to kind of bring up, it's you used an acronym, IPM.
IPM, yes.
Please tell us what that means and give us some context around it.
Okay, so IPM, Integrated Pest Management. I do not like to use chemical controls unless absolutely necessary, and there are times when I do believe it is appropriate to use chemical controls, but my preference is to not. And so the Integrated Pest Management is our crews, when they're on site, spend a lot of time just looking at the plants, picking up leaves, turning them over, seeing what's there, noticing if there's any chew marks on plants, on leaves. I will often get emails, photos from our crews saying, hey, I've noticed this on this property.
What is it?
So it'll be anything from Japanese beetle to aphids, which can be a nightmare here in Chicago. So just that constant, looking for things that are out of the ordinary. What could potentially be going on this property that if we catch it early, we can do something about it without having to do chemical controls.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
If you catch the infestation early enough, can you manage it through pruning and getting rid of that material?
Perfect. So you kind of alluded to a permaculture concept multiple times over our 10 minutes together so far. Are you familiar with permaculture? Have you done a permaculture design course?
I am familiar with permaculture, but I have not done any permaculture design courses, or I've actually never even really been in a permaculture garden.
Got it.
But it is definitely, there are things in the small amount that I've learned that
you're integrating
they make a lot of sense.
Oh,
but just,
yeah.
It's common sense things that you can do in your landscape to make sure that it's as productive, either in terms of generating food or productive in terms of creating a beautiful space.
Exactly. Well, I like to call permaculture the art and science of working with nature. And one of the first premise that I always talk about when I'm speaking of permaculture is observation. And you've mentioned multiple times along the way how you're out there observing. One of the things was, you're observing for bugs. And another one, you observed in your life what you're good at and what you're not so good at, and you went with what you were good at.
And even down to the basics of good design.
Yeah.
We really spend a lot of time talking with our customers about how they use the space. What are you going to be doing out here?
So
are you going to use it for play? Are you going to use it for eating? Are you going to use it just for lounging? Is there traffic flow that goes through here? I mean, all of these things. Is it viewed from inside? All of those things play a really important part. And if you don't take the time to learn what those things are, the design fails.
Right. It's not going to be successful. Good job. I love this. You're looking at it from a very holistic perspective. And I'm so all about that. So great work.
Well, if you haven't been trained, you've got to cling to something. So it's that patience and time, I think, is where.
Yeah, there you go. So today we're here to talk about tree selection and planting. And, we live in the desert Southwest, so I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. And so there's a couple, so we're going to talk about trees and tree planting, but we need to also distinguish that trees planted in my yard are going to be done differently, and there's going to be different things to notice than trees planted in your yard, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, because in Chicago, you're going to be able to grow, as you mentioned earlier, before we started, pawpaws. We can't even touch those here.
Not many people are brave enough to grow a pawpaw, but those who are rewarded generously with a delicious edible fruit.
Are they hard to grow?
Not particularly. They're just not. They're not a terribly ornamental tree.
Oh, got it.
And when you've got a tiny little space in Chicago, you're thinking probably more about ornament than you are food production.
Yeah. Well, we need to change that too.
Yeah.
So let's just jump in, talk about trees. How do you pick given what we just talked about, how do you pick the right tree?
It's all about the right plant for the right space. So there are a lot of things to consider before you ever go out to the nursery and buy one. First of all, what hardiness zone are you in? Here in Chicago, we're in zone 5. In Phoenix, what are you, 9?
9, yep.
Yeah, so, they're right there. That's a big difference. Another really important factor is soil type. If I had my way, I would grow beautiful rhododendrons in my yard, but I can't because we have really alkaline soil. We just don't have that acidic soil that the rhododendrons need and want. And it's not just that. Is your soil heavy clay, which it is here in my backyard in Chicago?
As it is here.
Or is it really sandy? And this is one of the odd things about Chicago. If I move closer to the lake, the more sandy the soil is. So if I'm working in Andersonville on the north side of Chicago, my crews love getting jobs up there because the soil is so nice and sandy.
You can easily dig in it. You don't need a jackhammer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. The other thing to consider when you're picking the tree is what the mature size is going to be. You don't want to plant a 40-foot wide, 70-foot tall tree, 6 feet off of your house.
Right.
And I see that all the time. My neighbor has 2 blue spruce that are planted way too close to his house, and they just are. It's egregious.
What's the problem with that?
Well, first of all, it makes his house completely out of scale. So he's got these ginormous blue spruce that are probably 60 feet tall, and his house is only 20 feet tall. And the scale of that house to tree ratio is out of whack, and so the house looks a little ridiculous next to those big trees. But from a function standpoint, not just a design standpoint,
right.
When you get that big of a tree planted that close to the home, you can start to run into issues with foundation problems where the tree roots are causing some issues with the foundation. So you definitely want to make sure that mature size of the tree is going to be in scale with the location that it's going.
What's the easiest way to figure that one out?
There's multiple ways. The internet is always great. Michael Durr's books, he will tell you exactly what that tree is going to be like and where it should be planted. It's an excellent resource. Or you can, most trees in nurseries are going to have a mature size on the tag when you buy it. So while you're at the nursery, you don't have to carry around Durr's book that weighs about 35 pounds. You can just look on the tag and get a sense of the mature size. And with mature size, that's also going to depend a lot on the variety of tree.
Oh, right.
So one of the trees that we plant a lot here in Chicago, because it's the right scale for our yards, is hornbeams, the European hornbeams.
Okay.
Now, if you get a straight species hornbeam, at maturity, it's going to be about 40 feet tall and about 15 to 18 feet wide.
Wow.
Now, if you're planting that right up next to your house, that means that you've got maintenance requirements down the road.
Right.
But there's another variety called Franz Fontaine European hornbeam, and the Franz Fontaine is going to get about the same height, but it's only going to get about 8 feet wide. Now, that may be a much better choice when you're planting it, close to a house or up along a fence line or something.
Much more columnar that way.
Yeah. So you have to make sure that mature size, even if you're getting a hornbeam, may be different if you're getting a Franz Fontaine versus a straight species. Right.
And then and really considering the root size, though, is important as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's not as much root size, but so much as it is the aggressive nature of the tree roots of the particular tree. So some trees just have a much more aggressive tree root system. Hornbeams aren't that bad. They tend to be an understory tree, so they don't do a lot of damage, but it's very specific to trees. So making sure that you're talking to an arborist or somebody who really understands trees is going to help be able to give you that direction. So, and then kind of once you determine some of these other structural things, hardiness zone, soil type, mature size, then it boils down to what do you want it to do? Do you want it to have seasonal interest? Do you want it to flower in the spring or summer? Do you want to have great fall color? Do you want it to be an evergreen? Do you want it to have a fruit? I mean, those are the things that you kind of have to look a little bit more into detail on each one of those characteristics of the tree and what you want it to accomplish.
Right. So when I wander into a nursery, how can I tell if a tree is healthy?
Yeah, it's really a difficult task, and it's one that we constantly are working on with our crews when they're going to the nursery to pick up plant material. Is we want them to be as fussy as possible and reject trees that are not healthy. But there's a lot to consider with that. So first of all, you have to understand that there's two different ways that you can get trees. You can get them containerized, and you can get them balled and burlapped, or B&B.
B&B, right?
Yeah. So B&B is very traditional. They go out, they plant the tree in the ground, they dig the tree out. They used to do it by hand. Now they have this machine a spade that just grabs the tree and plucks it out. That's the one that most people are going to be the most familiar with. Containerized trees they tend to be smaller. They don't you're not going to see kind of that big mature tree that you can get with B&B.
Right.
But there are some things that you need to look at on both of them. So if you're going to the nursery in the spring, before the trees leaf out, or even as they're leafing out, make sure that there are plenty of leaf buds and that they're nice and swollen and are really soft and supple. So that's a good indication that tree is healthy and is ready to kind of pop and go for the spring. I also really recommend that you check for the leaf scar. Now, this is a little bit more technical, but if you look at the ends of the branches where the bark changes color, so older growth is probably going to be a darker color, and then the newer growth is going to be lighter. If you look to see how long that lighter stem is, it's a good indication of whether or not that tree is happy. If you are seeing 4, 5, 6 inches of growth on that lighter section, that's a really good indication that tree did well last year and was happy where it was located. I also like to do the scratch test. So you take your thumbnail and you lightly scratch off a piece of bark on a really small little twig. And if underneath that layer of bark you see green, that means that tree is more than likely is alive. So that's a good indication. If you scratch it and it's brown, that branch is probably dead.
Of course.
And if you find that one of them is dead, maybe check 2 or 3 or 4 locations to see if there's more of them. And then kind of lastly in the spring, I like to just have our guys just kind of bend the branches and see if they're flexible. That means that there's moisture in them. That means that they're growing. If they snap and break, that's probably
not a good thing.
Plant that's not going to do well.
Yeah, exactly.
So then that's in the early spring. If you're purchasing the plant in the summer, so after it's leafed out, just make sure that the leaves are nice and full and not dry and wilted. That's a great indication that the plant is being cared for. Make sure that there's not a lot of dead branches. So step back from the tree, take a look up in the canopy, make sure that there's not, like half the tree isn't dead. I also really encourage our guys to get a sense of how that tree is growing. So, and this is not a general rule. It's because a lot of trees grow differently. But for instance, you just want to make sure that canopy is well shaped and formed. So a good example of that is a tree with a strong central leader. So that the trunk goes all the way up through the tree and all the way to the top with just one leader, and then there's branches coming off of it. On trees that have a strong central leader, you want to make sure that central leader doesn't break apart higher up in the tree. That tends to mean that there's some other potential problems down the road with that tree. If it's a multi-stem or a tree that doesn't have that, then you want to look more at just the overall shape. Is it shaped well? That tends to mean that the nursery who's growing it is doing a good job, and it's not planting the trees too close together.
Got it. So when you say up in the main leader, it splits apart. You mean like at Y? It turns into a Y up.
Exactly. And some trees that's very normal, and so that's why you can't always use that as a specific rule. But for certain trees, that is definitely the case.
Got it.
I also in the summer really like to get down and make sure if it's a B&B tree, I try and pull the burlap away a little bit, and I get my fingers in there to see if the soil is moist. If it's not, that's a problem. If it's containerized, it's a little bit easier to tell. If that, you can kind of see if it doesn't have quite enough soil or enough water. A lot of times you'll see kind of separation on the edge along the container, and it'll just be dry.
So what about it getting root bound? I've heard that before.
Okay, yeah, and that is kind of the next phase of checking the plants. So for trees that are in containers, it's hard to get a sense for that. Most of the time, you can't just pull the tree out of the container,
right.
or you can't cut the container, but you can look if the size of the tree is significantly larger than the container that it's in.
Right.
It may be a little suspect. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be a healthy tree, but you may want to be a little bit more careful about it. If you can, sometimes you're able to do this. If you're able to pull the plastic away a little bit, you can kind of see, you'll be able to see the edge of the root ball. If there are a lot of roots kind of around that edge, that is probably a good indication that that tree is a little bit more root bound, and you may want to avoid it.
Yeah.
And then in the same thing, you want to look for the root flare. So that's classic look where as you follow the tree down, right before it goes on the ground, it should flare out from the trunk. And if you don't see that flare, you know that tree, as it's been planted in the containers, the liners have probably, every time that they move it from one smaller container to a bigger container, it goes a little bit deeper and they cover more of that root flare, and then it goes a little bit deeper and cover. So you want to make sure that you see that root flare. Now on B&B trees, you also want to make sure, and this is a little bit trickier because you may have to untie some of the burlap around the outside of the tree to see if you can see the root flare, but you definitely want to do that. I also like to gently, you don't want to do it too hard, but I grab up 3 or 4 feet up on the tree trunk, and I move the tree back and forth a little bit.
Yep.
If the tree moves out separate from the root ball, so if it seems like the tree is loose on the root ball, that's a bad sign. It means that there's probably some significant damage on the roots itself.
Wow.
And then, I also really, again, on B&B trees, making sure that soil is moist. It can just dry out so quickly.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What about tree staking? Sometimes I know I get trees in my yard. In fact, I have one that I just planted last week that has a half-inch diameter stake that's lashed to the tree. What do we do in that case?
Well, it kind of depends on the tree. So a lot of times when trees are coming from a nursery, and you'll see this more with ornamentals and more with containerized trees. The ornamentals, a lot of times they use that stake to try and guide the tree as it's growing so that it grows more upright. And then containerized trees, a lot of times they can get blown in the wind, and so by staking them, it really will help them to manage some of that damage that the wind can cause.
Yeah.
Now, my preference is if it is a containerized tree that is staked, I like to remove the stake when we plant it.
Yeah.
If a tree needs to be, if you're concerned that the tree is going to blow over, there are better staking mechanisms and ways to do that than having that stake right up against the tree trunk. Now, on ornamental trees, so let's say, for instance, you are buying, and this is, I guess it's not so much an ornamental tree as it is an ornamental shrub, but if you get a tree-form hydrangea, so that's a very popular way that we'll install like limelight or PG or Tardiva hydrangeas that have been trained as a single stem, and then they have the top is nice and big. We call it tree form or on standard. That tree needs that additional support. So a lot of times we'll leave that stake on there because the stem is too small for the large size of the head that's on it.
Yeah, exactly.
But then what we do is we make sure that our crews over the course of the next 2 or 3 years are monitoring that stake and making sure that the points where it's tied onto the stem are not damaging the tree.
So you said there are better ways to stake it. Can you speak to one of them?
Sure. Probably the best way to stake like a deciduous upright tree is we like to put 3 posts in, about anywhere from, let's say, 2 feet, maybe a little bit farther, depending on the size of the tree. But a typical 2.5-inch caliper tree, we like to put a stake in the ground, 3 of them, about 2 feet away from it, and then we
in a triangle shape, right?
In a triangle shape, correct. And then we tie. It can either be wire or rope, as long as you're protecting it around the tree.
Trunk,
and then you stake the tree in that triangle shape but you don't want to do it too tight. You want that tree to be able to blow some, because that'll actually build strength in both the tree and the stem as well as in the roots. So you want it to be able to move some, but you don't want it to move too far. So you just want to have it nice and loose. And then, after a couple of years, that tree is going to have a fully established root system that's not, you can just take those stakes out.
Right, perfect. So can we talk about planting depth? And is there a way to plant a tree at a wrong depth?
Absolutely. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves.
I can tell. Go.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. I drive by and I see trees that are just buried, and it's painful to me, because you're basically giving the kiss of death to that tree. So there are 2 big mistakes that people make. They either plant the tree too high, and if you plant the tree too high, it makes it more susceptible to being blown over. And it also, the tree will dry out much more quickly. With the root ball exposed more, it just is going to dry out more quickly. But I would prefer my crews plant a tree high any day of the week than planting it too low.
Oh,
in
really?
fact, one of the phrases that I tell my guys: plant it high, it won't die. We can control a tree that got planted too high. We cannot control one. We can manage it. We can mulch the root ball. We can make sure it's getting the proper amount of water. We can stake it. But if that tree gets planted too low, there's not a whole lot that you can do to save that tree over time. Yeah. So I mean, kind of the biggest thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is the root flare. If you cannot see that root flare, if the tree goes directly, it's nice and straight all the way right into the ground. If there's no flare out at the bottom, that means that tree is planted too deeply. And kind of the biggest problem with this is that the tree will compensate. The trees need oxygen. They need easy access to moisture. They want to have these feeder roots at the surface. And so a tree is going to compensate by sending out secondary root growth that grows up from the root ball straight up towards the surface. This takes additional stored energy away from proper root development because it's being forced to do this, which it doesn't want to. And then the other problem that this causes is over time, and I'm talking 5, 10, 15 years, these roots are going to continue to grow. And when you have that big of a mass of roots around a tree trunk, it's going to girdle that trunk. Oh, yes. And I have seen 30-foot-tall trees that have had girdled trunks that have blown over in 20-mile-an-hour winds. Yeah. So say more about girdled. What's that mean? So the tree roots will get into this habit, and you see it mostly. Well, there's quite a few different times that you'll see it. Yeah. So, you see it in containerized trees, so that the tree roots will go out to the edge of the container. They can't go anywhere else, so they turn and they start going around the tree. In circles, yeah. And that's what the girdled tree is, when those roots go around in a circle instead of straight out. So containerized trees, you can manage that when you plant it. You can loosen up those roots.
Yep.
You can, if they won't loosen up just with your fingers, I've even taken a pruning saw and pruned, made vertical slices. But when you plant a tree too low, it's very hard to control those girdling roots because you're forcing that tree to grow girdling roots.
Yeah.
Another time that I've seen it, girdling roots, is when people always think, oh, well, I've got to amend the soil. I want to amend the soil. So they'll dig the hole, they put the tree in it, and they have heavy clay soil. And then they put all this beautiful compost around that tree, and it's super easy for the roots to grow in it. And those tree roots are going to go right through that compost. They're going to hit that heavy clay, and they're going to be like, why would I go in the clay? I've got all this nice compost.
Yes.
And so then they grow around and around.
Yeah.
So, we're very careful. We don't do a lot of soil amendments when we plant trees. We like to use the soil that came out of the hole to replant that tree, so that tree knows that it's those. It's heavy clay soil. I gotta keep on pressing forward and getting my roots to spread out.
Yeah. Interesting, because I encourage people, and I've heard this before, in my fruit tree program here in Phoenix, I encourage people to add, because we have such dense soil here, add 50% organic material and mix it in with the native soil. And I had never stopped to consider that the roots might actually stop. So you've actually seen that happen.
Yeah. There was there's a customer of ours. It was a commercial property, and it was exceedingly heavy clay soil. But you could just see the tree blew over, and you could just see the girdling roots around it. Now, and this is there's the whole nother conversation about checking soil fertility and making sure that tree has the nutrients that it needs to grow. So, you can't, if you don't have any nutrients in your soil, which, how much of Chicago doesn't. So there is a balance to be made with that. And there are other ways to encourage, positive root growth. I've seen where guys have cut slices into the outside of the planting hole.
Yeah, that's what I encourage people to do.
Yeah, and I've also seen where arborist has, where they've found that a tree is doing some girdling, they'll take an auger, like a small diameter auger, like a bulb planting size, and they'll drill holes out, radiating out from the tree to just encourage a little bit more aeration and get those tree roots to grow out.
Yeah, nice. So it takes
but now we're really talking some complicated arboriculture here, though.
Yeah.
So,
well,
most homeowners aren't going to do it.
Yes, and you still have to dig a hole. And if you have hard soil, what I encourage people to do is take a pickaxe or a shovel and just scar the
loosen
edge
up those sides.
Yeah,
yep.
And that helps a lot, I think, doesn't it?
I think we would say that is giving the root purchase.
Okay. Perfect.
So it's got a place to kind of dig in.
To dig in and go.
Turn around.
Exactly. Cool. So, what is the biggest mistake consumers can make in planting a tree?
Well, as we've talked about, the biggest one is the depth that the tree gets planted at.
Right.
But following really close behind that is watering.
Oh, yes.
And I like to tell people that the number one reason that trees die in the first year of planting is that people don't water them enough. And the number two reason why plants died in the first year is because people water
them too much, right?
Is they water them too much.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a really fine balance that you have to take. And again, this is so dependent on soil. If you have sandy soil, you are going to have to water a lot more. If you have heavy clay soil, you're not going to have to water as much. But if you don't water, your plant is in trouble.
Yeah.
So what I really encourage people to do is go out at least once a week to begin with, maybe even more often. If you've planted that tree during the summer, you probably want to do it more often. Go out, take a spade, like a little hand trowel, dig down about, just right about where the tree root ball ends, dig down 6 inches. If the soil is dry, water. if the soil is moist, come back in a day or two and check again. If the soil is wet, wait a week, come back and check it again.
Yeah.
So, like, it's just, you want that soil to be evenly moist. You don't want it to be fully saturated because that will keep oxygen from getting to the plants. But at the same time, if it dries out, it particularly, our biggest concern on our roof deck projects is we would rather keep water running all the time on them because the soil, we know that the planting media that we use will freely drain, so they're not going to sit in soil.
Right.
But as soon as those trees dry out, that sun, that wind, it's going to desiccate those plants. And so the biggest concern is making sure that once you've exposed that flare, that you're keeping that plant evenly moist.
Yeah.
And I really encourage people on new trees to do this, not just for the first year, but really for the first 2 years, is really make sure that you're monitoring that soil moisture. These are plants that are going to make the biggest impact in the long term.
Yeah.
You have let's say a 30-year-old tree in front of your house. That's a $50,000 plant. You can't replace that plant.
Right.
So, making sure that you're caring for it is a really solid investment for the resale value of your home, for the overall enjoyment of the home as well.
And recently I found out something, actually one of my tree coaches, the guy that I work with on the fruit tree program, he said go out and buy a moisture meter.
Oh, yeah.
And I just spent $7.99 at the local nursery and bought an inexpensive moisture meter. And what I discovered was that I was overwatering some potted trees.
Yeah. It's really interesting. My wife's grandmother, she a lovely woman, but man, she can overwater. Every day she goes out and waters, and we tell her, like, you're damn, like, well, why did my tree die? Well, because you're overwatering. Like, you have to slow down. You have to make sure that the plant is getting the moisture that it needs, but not getting too much.
Yeah. Perfect. What about mulching trees?
The biggest issue that we find with mulch is that people pile it too high. We call them the mulch volcanoes. And you see them everywhere. And, we see them all over here in Chicago, and we thought, well, maybe it's just a Chicago problem. And we were down in Memphis over the Memorial Day weekend, and there's mulch volcanoes in Memphis. And we thought, well, I don't know, maybe it's just Memphis and Chicago. And then we were in Portland in June at my niece's graduation. They've got mulch volcanoes there. There's mulch volcanoes everywhere.
Interesting.
And you're basically doing the same thing to the tree as when you don't plant it at the proper depth. If you're adding that mulch so high up onto the tree that it's covering up its root flare in the
you don't
stem,
want to do that. Right.
Yeah, it's holding moisture up against it. It's causing potential areas for rot. Yeah. Then as soon as you get that rot, then it opens the tree up to being susceptible to invasive diseases and pathogens. So we really recommend 2 to 3 inch mulch depth, and then making sure that as you get towards that root flare, that it maybe goes down to no mulch, that you just are really tapering it off.
That's really, really important, is not to cover the trunk up. What we found here, though, in the desert, we need that extra mulch to hold in the moisture. And I actually have a friend of mine who has a foot of wood chips in his backyard, and he's turned his backyard into this incredible forest. So I guess, and that again showcases the, different climates. It works differently.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and we'd really, particularly like parkway trees, so that space between the sidewalk and the road. Right, exactly. Here in Chicago, those are horribly neglected spaces.
Here in Phoenix too.
Just making sure that you're doing everything that you can for that tree, and it all depends. We actually really like to we use a pine fines mulch. It's a little bit finer mulch. what's nice about it is it has a little bit more acidity because it's a pine.
Pine, exactly.
It's smaller, so it breaks down a little bit more quickly, so it's adding nutrients to the soil.
Mm-hmm.
We're still putting it on thick enough that it's doing a good job of doing that a moisture retention, as well as moderating the sun. So it can even out or make the temperature variations for that tree root ball decrease pretty significantly as well. So it's doing all of those things. Now, shredded hardwood is a very popular mulch here in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And that works well. It probably lasts a little bit longer than the pine fines, but that's part of the reason why I like the pine fines is that they don't last as long. They're breaking down and they're adding organic material to the soil.
Yeah. Cool. Well, you have given us a ton of information about trees and planting, so I so appreciate that. And I'm going to
absolutely.
And I'm going to shift on you a little bit. I want to know what drives you. What's your big why behind all of this?
I don't like wasting money. So, I mean, our whole business model is, we do high-end landscape design and install. I recognize that we are a luxury service. I do not want to be a luxury service that then wastes your money.
Yeah.
So, if somebody is going to spend a significant amount of money to redo a small space, I don't want to plant that tree in the front yard improperly so that in another 5 years it dies and that homeowner is then mad at me because either I didn't pick the right tree or I planted it wrong. I want to make sure that we have long-term success in these spaces for these customers who are investing so much money in that space. So that's really the biggest driver is creating value and value. It's a little bit different for everybody and what that means, but creating that value and doing it right the first time.
Beautiful. So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there one or two books, you already mentioned one, which we're going to talk about again, that really has driven home these concepts for you?
Well, I mean, probably my favorite book in terms of garden design is Thomas Church, Gardens Are for People. He really drove kind of the modern garden design movement, and it has been very influential in terms of how I view space. He has this great quote, and I may not get this exactly right, but I take this to heart in every space that we work in because we work in such an urban and human-made space. I think of this quote on every single project. It is a little unfair to attempt to prove that nature has crept slyly over the fence and done the job for you. And the thing I love about that is it's this notion of honesty in design. And that really kind of guides. It's different when you have acres of space and you can create that babbling brook through the property. It's really hard for me to do that here in Chicago. So
yeah, exactly.
So Thomas Church, and then just as far as tree care, it's definitely Durr. Michael Durr is the guy.
That's
so
the one.
anything that
Michael
he
Durr.
writes, anything he writes is kind of the gold standard for woody plants. So
perfect. What one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, it's the advice that I give to my guys all the time when they call and they say, well, we could do it this way or that way. And my response is, which way is the more difficult way to do it? And that is probably the way that it needs to be done. And when you're planting a tree, think of it this way. So I've got a tree and the root ball is 2 feet wide. I could dig a 2-foot wide hole and drop that tree in, but that's not what's best for the tree. What's best for the tree is to dig a hole that's 1.5 times the size of that root ball. So it takes more time. It takes more effort to peel back the burlap and expose that tree root flare. It takes more time to water that plant in as you're planting it, so that to make sure that it's fully watered when it goes in, to make sure that it doesn't have any air pockets that are going to suck moisture out of it over the course of its life. Those are the more difficult things. So in terms of for homeowners is a lot of times it's very easy to just hire the lowest cost provider to come and do tree care. Yeah. Or it's easiest to go to the big box store. And I'm not saying that you can't get trees at big box stores, but it's much more difficult to choose the right tree, the healthy tree at the big box store than it is if you're going to a garden center where they have a trained staff that's going to help you with selection, both of variety as well as, this maple tree versus that maple tree. Why is this one a better tree for you?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, one of the things that I have found over and over and over again here in Phoenix is that the big box stores will sell you a tree no matter what, and I deal in fruit trees, no matter whether it's going to produce fruit here or not. And so quite often my customers come to me afterwards and said, well, I planted this tree from, this big box store, and, it's not the kind that's ever going to make fruit here. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's, and it's all about education. And I mean, you can have garden centers that don't have educated staff as well. Right. So, it's consensus. And that's why I really advocate, talking to botanical gardens and arboretums, talking to your local university extension office, talking to professionals, professional arborists or professional landscapers, getting a multitude of information, and then finding the consensus within that information.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Craig. It has been a treat chatting with you.
Well, thank you very much as well.
Absolutely. So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way is on our website. It's topiarius.com. And would you like me to spell that?
Yeah, let's spell that for everybody.
It's topiarius.com. And then from there, they'll have you links for our Facebook page and our Twitter and our Instagram and all of that.
Perfect. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.